defend the Constitution. That's important. And so what you have now is you've had for decades, and this isn't only concerning one party or the other. You've had presidents who have actually said they should go beyond the Constitution. In other words, they should do something unconstitutional if it means protecting us. In other words, that they're saying that they should be able to violate the Constitution if it means that it's protecting us as people who live within the United States. And if you allow that, then that means what's more important is what the president thinks they should do to protect us is more important than what the Constitution means. And that means the Constitution has no meaning. That's why it's important for us all to understand the Constitution and what it does and how it protects us. So that then we understand what should be the top priority of the president, what should be the top priority of all of us as citizens of the United States, is to protect the Constitution. Because that's what protects us. We should all live our lives under this oath. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will do to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And if we find a president who is not protecting, preserving, defending the Constitution, then we need to get them out and not let them back in. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Navy in the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. Okay? This, again, is where things have changed a lot in our country since when the Constitution was originally written. Today, we think of the president as a commander-in-chief of the armed forces all the time. And that's not the way it was meant by the framers of the Constitution. Because, again, it says, the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. Think of the word actual. Okay? Called into action. Called into the actual service is another way of saying called into action. Okay? A military force that exists during peacetime when the United States is not at war the military then is not in the actual service of the United States. Only when Congress declares war on a specific country are the armed forces called into actual service. And once you have that declaration of war, then the president is the commander-in-chief. And then when the war is over, it's Congress that controls the military. So when the military service exists during peacetime, it's Congress that's in charge. It's only when they are called into actual service. Now, that has pretty much changed since World War II. Increasingly, the world has become more complicated, more divided. Wars are becoming more controversial. And as a result, members of Congress have become afraid to declare war. Because the one who declares war is the one who, in the end, bears the responsibility of the war. And no matter what you might think going in to a war, you never know how long it's actually going to last. And the longer a war lasts, the more unpopular it gets. And so members of Congress who are much more concerned about keeping their seat in office, they don't want to declare war, even if it's necessary. They would just rather let the president do it. So that way, if the president takes the initiative and takes the American soldiers into war, well then, if the war goes badly, then members of Congress can point their finger at the president and say, it's his fault. And if the war goes well and everything's hunky-dory and it's all popular, then the members of Congress can say, yeah, we were with him. So they can take the credit when there's credit to be taken, but then they can put the blame on the president when that becomes necessary. And again, that's Congress abdicating one of their central responsibilities. And this has the effect of theoretically making the president a military dictator. Certainly putting making the possibility of the president becoming a military dictator much more feasible. And so this is one of the reasons why you hear so much talk about this election and about how American democracy is under threat. When you think about what I just said about the president becoming nearly a military dictator, you bring that in with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. We are far closer to a dictatorship than most Americans realize. And I'm not the only one who understands this. This is why there are so many voices in this country saying we've got to protect American democracy. Okay? And so, something else that needs to be understood about the president is when it says the president shall exercise the executive authority, that means the president shall enforce the law. So Congress passes the law. The president enforces the law. Okay? So two things then. Let's go back to the Articles of Confederation. When the Articles of Confederation were originally written, they did not allow Congress the ability to enforce its authority, and they did not allow Congress to raise revenue. The first power, as we saw earlier, that this Constitution gives Congress is the power to raise revenue. And by virtue of the president existing, it means the laws passed by Congress will be enforced. And that is the president's job. Now, the president does have the authority to veto laws passed by Congress. So in other words, if Congress passes a law that the president can't justifiably enforce, the president does have the authority to veto that legislation. Now, Congress can override a presidential veto, but it's a difficult process to do that. Under normal conditions, Congress passing laws, they pass laws by a simple majority, 50% plus one. But if the president vetoes the law, to override a president's veto, it requires a 2/3 majority, which is a very difficult standard to reach. Not impossible, but difficult. And when you put this in perspective, this again highlights just how powerful the president of the United States can be. So let me give you an illustration. These numbers go back to 2015, but I don't think much has changed. Between 1789, when George Washington first took office, and 2015, when Barack Obama ended his second term, the president had vetoed 1,500 different pieces of legislation passed by Congress. So over that 126-year period, from 1789 to 2015, the president had vetoed 1,500, had issued a veto 1,500 times. Of the 1,500, Congress overrode a presidential veto only 110 times. So that pretty much means if the president says no to the legislation, that means no. Okay? So then, the president does have significant power. And so now let's take a look at Article 3. Now, sometimes it's said, and this is just a technical point, sometimes it's said that the Article 3 of the Constitution established the Supreme Court. No, it really didn't. By the time they had gotten to this part of the Constitution, they had already been working on it for almost 3 months. Coming up with the details of actually how to structure a federal court system, including a Supreme Court, would have required a significant amount of time. So it simply says that there will be a Supreme Court. There will be a system of federal courts. So again, by including this language in the Constitution, it guaranteed that there would be a Supreme Court. It guaranteed that there would be federal courts, but they would be established later. And so the technical aspects of what the Supreme Court included, what the Supreme Court and the federal courts entailed, that was actually put into effect by the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789. So the very year that this new Constitution took effect, the details were all worked out and a federal court system was put in place. Now, the Constitution, this part of the Constitution is again coming into a lot of question because you're hearing a lot about Supreme Court reform. And the Supreme Court has become increasingly anti-democratic. In other words, they have taken positions where an overwhelming majority of Americans disagree with them, and they've simply ignored the reality for a majority of Americans, and they've ruled against the sentiments of a majority of the country. And that can be very difficult and problematic. And so one of the solutions you're hearing being discussed is by how we currently have 9 justices on the Supreme Court, increasing that number to 13. It's important to note, the Constitution does not establish how many Supreme Court justices there are to be, and neither does the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789. It seems to be connected, although I haven't seen any specific evidence to this, to be connected to circuit appellate courts. So, for example, in the 1790s, the first Supreme Court of the United States had 6 Supreme Court justices, and we had 6 circuit appellate courts. And so the idea then is that the appeals court are the ones who will appeal cases to the Supreme Court, and the country is divided into regions. And so then a Supreme Court justice will be assigned to an appellate court circuit. So the appeals from that circuit go to that Supreme Court justice. The appeals from this circuit go to that Supreme Court justice. So if there are 6 circuit appellate courts, you need 6 Supreme Court justices. Now, by the Civil War, we had established 9 appellate courts, and there were 9 justices. And for some reason, Congress simply decided to leave it at 9. But it's still open to possibility that Congress can change that number. In fact, when Justice Antonin Scalia died, and the Senate refused to consider a new nominee to fill Scalia's place, at that point, they reduced the Supreme Court to 8. So we've actually had in our recent history where the Senate reduced the number of Supreme Court justices to 8, and now we're back up to 9. But here's the thing. We have now 12 appellate circuit courts, but we still have only 9. Usually, when the framers of the Constitution left something open, it's because they expected that there may be more required at some point. And again, like I said, I've never seen any direct evidence to this, but it seems to be the logic behind how the justices of the Supreme Court went from originally having 6 to having 9 by the time of the Civil War, and then Congress just simply agreeing that they would not go above 9 after the Civil War. Well then, today we have 12, which then, what would be most important is to make sure that the Supreme Court, the numbers of Supreme Court justices would have to be odd, so that you could not have a tie. So you'd want to keep an odd number of justices. So that means if there is this connection between the appellate courts and the number of Supreme Court justices, it would need, if there are 12 appellate courts, that's an even number. So then it would need to be either 11 Supreme Court justices keeping it odd, or 13, so that you keep an odd number. Okay? But again, this is something that is coming up in a lot of discussion. I may be assuming that you're paying more attention to the news than you actually are. I hope you pay attention. I hope you get yourself involved. But again, if you are paying attention, I want you to be aware of these kinds of issues that are coming up. Another unique aspect of our Constitution that is worth mentioning, and it's come up today, is we define, our Constitution provides a specific definition for what it means to commit treason. The word treason in popular culture is used far too loosely. Okay? Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. Okay? So, the only way that a person under our Constitution commits treason against the United States is to levy war against the United States, to be an American citizen who levies war against the United States. Which then means the only people in American history as of today who have levied war against the United States is the Confederacy. When the South seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy, even then, if that's where they stopped, that's not treason. But what will happen is the Confederacy will go to war against the United States. And that made what they did treason. And so, just to mention, Donald Trump gets a lot of criticism. And sometimes people talk about Donald Trump as committing treason. He has not committed treason. Yes, he has been accused of committing other crimes. He has even been indicted for committing crimes. He is awaiting trial for crimes for which he has been indicted. But he has not committed treason. Now, let's also be clear. After the Constitution was written, increasingly there were issues that developed where there were acts of violence, organized acts of violence, that resulted in the death of government officials. And yet they did not rise to the level of levying war. And so Congress early in our history came up with a distinction: insurrection. So insurrection is not as severe as going to war. Okay? But nonetheless, it is taken seriously enough because it has resulted in significant damage, death, injury. It has interrupted official government proceedings. So it can't just be ignored. But because it's coming from such a limited area, it does not rise to the level of treason. And so, one way to think of insurrection is a riot with a specific